sleeping against her chest, curled into the hollow of her collarbone like they had mapped it weeks ago and decided it would do, were two wolf pups the size of her forearm, black-furred and warm, and deeply, utterly asleep. Sarah did not move. She had learned early that stillness was its own kind of competence, that the ability to remain motionless in a cold room while two infant wolves breathed against your sternum was not nothing, even if no one in this court would name it as skill. She had learned it in the way she had learned most things here, by necessity, by repetition, by being the person left in the room when everyone with a better claim had gone somewhere warmer. The fire in the nursery had burned low. Outside the narrow window, the winter sky was the particular gray of late afternoon, the kind that promised nothing, not snow, not clearing, just a continuation of itself. Sarah sat in the chair that had been placed near the hearth for Mira, the head attendant, who had gone to her own quarters 3 hours ago with a headache that turned out to be wine. The chair was too wide for Sarah's frame, and she had folded herself into it, the way she folded herself into most things that were not made for her, efficiently, without complaint, making the accommodation invisible. The pups had been left in the crib built for a single occupant, which meant they had immediately pressed into each other for warmth, and then, when that proved insufficient, had made their displeasure known in the high, thin, escalating way that infant wolves made displeasure known. Sarah had lifted them without being asked. She had held them against the warmth of her chest and walked the length of the nursery 14 times, she had counted, as she counted most things, and they had quieted by the 8th pass and gone limp by the 12th, and now slept with the boneless certainty of creatures who had decided the world was satisfactory for the moment. She had not been asked to do this. She was not the pup's designated attendant. She was not, technically, anyone's designated anything. Her role in the Ashvale court was the kind that existed in the space between titles. She cleaned the medicinal stores and recorded the inventory. She carried linens when the main attendants were occupied. She repaired the seam of anything that required repairing. She sat with the pups of the Alpha King when the actual attendants decided their headaches outweighed their duty. She was the one the court used when they needed a task done and had no interest in assigning credit for it. She was used to this. Not content with it, she had long since stopped confusing resignation with contentment, but used to it, the way you grew used to a draft from a window that would never quite seal. You stopped expecting it to be fixed. You brought a second layer and kept working. The pups shifted. The smaller one, she had come to think of them as the loud one and the small one, because no one had told her their names, turned its nose toward her throat, and inhaled in a long, slow pull, the way young wolves sorted the world into categories. Safe, not safe, worth staying near. It made a small sound, not quite a whimper, more like a punctuation mark, and went still again. Sarah let out a breath through her nose. The door to the nursery opened. It did not open the way doors opened when attendants entered, with a careful, apologetic quietness, a deliberate management of sound, out of respect for sleeping animals. It opened with the weight of someone who had not, in a very long time, made themselves smaller for a room's convenience. It opened with authority, and the authority was not practiced or performed. It was simply the way the air changed when Caius Dren walked through a threshold. She did not turn her head. She could not, without disturbing the pups. She heard him stop. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the nursery's usual quiet. It had a quality to it, an attention, a held breath that was not hers. She waited. She was good at waiting. It was, arguably, the thing she did best. Part 2. Sarah had come to the Ashvale court 4 years ago, at 19, through the kind of arrangement that was not quite charity and not quite commerce, but occupied the uncomfortable ground between the two. Her mother had known someone who had known someone who had spoken a word to an Ashvale steward, and the steward, who needed bodies for the lower court functions and was not particular about their provenance, had agreed to take her on. She had no designation that mattered here. She was an Omega, which in the Ashvale court translated approximately to nothing, not an insult, simply a fact of architecture, the way certain rooms faced north and received no direct light regardless of what was kept in them. The court's Omegas, who held real positions, had come in through family alliances or through bonds with men who carried weight. Sarah had come in through a word spoken to a steward, and the room she was given faced north. She did not complain about the room. She oriented herself by other means, by the work, which was always available, and by the small private satisfaction of doing it well, which no one could take from her, even when they declined to notice it. Her days followed a pattern that had been established in the first month and had not materially changed since. She rose before the main staff, which meant before the first pale light reached even the north-facing window, and she dressed in the dark by feel, the grey shift, the heavy overdress that had been someone else's before it was hers, the boots with the split seam on the left heel that she kept meaning to have resoled and kept not getting to, because there was always something more urgent. She tied her hair back with a strip of cloth that had once been a sash, now cut down for utility. She did not look at herself in the glass, because the glass in her room was too small and too clouded to tell her anything useful, and she had decided that useful information was the only kind worth pursuing. The medicinal stores were in the east wing, in a long, low room that smelled of dried herbs and camphor, and the particular dusty sweetness of bark stored too long. Sarah kept the inventory in a ledger that she had requisitioned through 3 separate channels before anyone agreed to provide it, and the ledger was precise in a way that the previous records, kept in scattered notes by 4 different people with 4 different systems, had not been. She had spent the first 6 weeks of her posting here simply reconciling what was there against what had been recorded as there, and the work had been unglamorous in exactly the way she had expected, and had produced a result no one had thanked her for, but that everyone had benefited from when the court physician needed to locate dried silverweed quickly and found it catalogued, dated, and placed where the catalogue said it would be. That was the shape of her competence. It was not spectacular. It did not announce itself. It was the kind of competence that only became visible in its absence, the well-indexed record no one noticed until they needed it at urgency and found it there. The Pups' nursery had been added to her informal duties 8 weeks ago, when Mira had decided that overnight attendance was beneath her and had arranged the situation so that it was simply understood Sarah would take the hours no one else wanted. There had been no discussion and no additional provision made for her. She had simply begun appearing, as she appeared everywhere she was needed, and the court had absorbed this, the way it absorbed all her labor, without acknowledgement, which was not the same as without gratitude, though it was difficult on cold nights to tell the difference. She had her own reasons for not resisting it. The pups were very young, still in the weeks when an infant wolf slept in fits and starts, and cried when no one came, and something in Sarah had been unable to simply enter that system without doing the work properly. She could have sat in the corner and let them cry at intervals and called it adequate. She had not. She did not know if this was virtue or stubbornness. She suspected the distinction did not matter as much as people thought. What she knew about the pups she had gathered in increments, the way she gathered most information, by being present and quiet, and allowing the space to tell her things. She knew they had been born 6 weeks ago. She knew their mother was not in the court, though no one had said so directly. She had inferred it from the absence of a claiming scent in the nursery, and from the way the attendants spoke around the subject, with the practiced avoidance of people who had been told not to speak on it. She knew the Alpha King had visited the nursery twice, in the 8 weeks she had been attending it, and that both visits had been brief, and had happened while Mira was present, which meant Sarah had not been in the room for either of them. She knew his name, Caius Dren, the way everyone in a court knows the name of the person at its apex, through constant reference, through the weight other people's voices put on the syllables. She had never been in the same room as him. He moved through the upper court, through spaces she did not enter, and she moved through the lower functions, through rooms that were unremarkable and necessary, and invisible in exactly the proportion she was. She had not expected this to change. The door opening, that evening, with the pups on her chest, and the fire low, and the winter sky doing its nothing outside the window, was not, in the first second, alarming. Doors opened. People came in. Sarah remained still, and waited to see which category of person this would be, the kind who would register her and require something of her, or the kind who would not register her at all. Then the quality of the silence told her something. The pups told her something too. The small one, which had been deeply asleep against her collarbone, twitched its nose once and pressed harder against her, not in fear, but in the way small animals moved toward the thing their body had already recognized before their eyes opened. The larger one made a very quiet sound, somewhere between a whimper and a sigh, and was still. Sarah looked up. Caius Dren was standing in the doorway of the nursery, and he was looking at her. Part 3. He was, in the way that centuries-old things sometimes were, difficult to fully account for in a single impression. He was large, not in the exaggerated way of men who built themselves up through deliberate effort, but in the way of something that had grown into its frame over a very long time and found the frame adequate. His shoulders filled the doorway without effort. His face was arranged into an expression that was not anger and not surprise, and was not, precisely, any of the things Sarah had a quick word for. He wore no crown, but this seemed less like an absence and more like a considered decision, the way a stone does not need to announce that it is a stone. He had come, she understood, to remove her. This was not paranoia. It was simple probability. The Alpha King of Ashvale did not appear in his pup's nursery to pay a social call on the Omega, who occupied it without title or invitation. She had been found in a space she had no formal right to occupy, with his children on her chest. The only reasonable interpretation was that she was about to be told to leave. She did not move. She could not, without waking the pups, and the pups were asleep. He had not spoken. She waited. "Why are you holding them?" His voice was what she had not been prepared for, lower than she had expected, unhurried, and with the particular quality of a sound that had learned over a very long time not to need to repeat itself. "They were crying," she said. "The fire had gone low. I lifted them." He looked at her. She was aware of the nature of that look in the way she was aware of changes in air pressure, not through alarm, but through a careful attention to environment that had been useful to her across 4 years of navigating spaces that were not made for her. "Where is Mira?" "Her quarters. She developed a headache approximately 3 hours ago." A pause. "Approximately 3 hours, and perhaps 20 minutes. I was not watching the clock precisely." Something in his face shifted. It was not a smile. It was the remote cousin of a smile, the kind of thing that happened in a face that had long ago learned to withhold most of what moved through it. "You counted the passes," he said, "when you walked the room." It was not a question. She felt the attention of it, the fact that he had been there longer than she'd realized, or had spoken to someone who had been. 14, she said. They quieted at the 8th. He took a step into the room. The pups did not startle. The small one shifted again, pressing its nose to Sarah's throat, and inhaled. The sound it made was not a cry. It was something much closer to the opposite. Caius Dren went very still. It was the kind of stillness that was not the absence of movement, but its opposite, a fullness, a complete containment of everything that had been about to move. He looked at the pups. He looked at the small one's nose against Sarah's throat. He looked at this for what felt to Sarah like a long time, though she was aware that her sense of duration was being distorted by the steadiness of his attention, and the fact that she could not look away from it without looking away from him, which did not feel like an option available to her at this moment. "What is your name?" he said. "Sarah." She did not add a family name. She did not have one that would mean anything here, and she had learned not to attach meaningless information to meaningful moments. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "How long have you been attending them?" 8 weeks. Mira's night arrangement. Yes. He looked at the pups again. The larger one had turned its face toward him now, still asleep, and the sound it made was different than the sounds it had been making, less the punctuation of contentment, and more something resonant and low, something that a pup's very young body produced when it was in proximity to the scent it was keyed to from the moment it drew its first breath. His scent, their father's scent, the pup's wolf, which was 8 weeks old and knew almost nothing, knew this. His jaw tightened. She watched him make a decision that was not, she thought, the decision he had entered the room to make. "Don't move," he said, "until they wake on their own." "I wasn't planning to," Sarah said. He looked at her again, and this time there was something in it she did not have a clean word for. Not gratitude. Gratitude was softer than this, more yielding. Not scrutiny either, though there was scrutiny in it. It was the look of someone who had walked into a room, expecting to find one thing, and had found another thing entirely, and was now recalibrating the nature of the room. He turned and left, and the door did not close loudly behind him. She sat with the pups on her chest, and the fire low, and the winter sky beyond the window, and she breathed carefully, and she did not think about the weight of his attention, still in the room with her, the way warmth lingers after a fire is banked. She thought about the inventory. She thought about the silverweed that needed to be rotated before the next month. She thought about the left heel of her boot. The pups slept, the evening settled, and Sarah stayed where she was, as she had always stayed, in the room that needed her, long past the hour when anyone was watching. Part 4. He came back the next evening, and the evening after that. He did not announce his visits. He did not send word ahead. He simply appeared in the nursery doorway, in the same way as the first time, with the quiet authority of someone who did not require permission to enter a room he owned, and stood long enough to see that the pups were settled, and the fire was adequate, and Sarah was there, and then he left. He did not speak on the second visit. On the third, he asked a single question. "Are they eating well?" "The larger one is. The smaller one has been slower to latch during the morning feed. Mira adjusts the positioning, but the small one corrects faster when held slightly more upright." She paused. "I mentioned this to the court physician. He said it was not unusual for the lighter pup in a pair." Cayestren looked at her for a moment, and in that moment, Sarah became aware that she had given a great deal of information in what she had thought was a plain and functional answer, and that he was processing not just the information, but the fact of it, the fact that she had noticed, had tracked, had spoken to the physician, had remembered the answer. "Has the positioning been adjusted?" "I adjust it myself during the night feeds." He nodded once. He left. On the fourth visit, he stayed. Not long, perhaps 20 minutes. He sat in the chair near the window, rather than the one near the fire, and the chair was closer to her than the door, which meant she was aware of him in a different way than she had been when he was a figure in a threshold. He smelled of cold air and something darker beneath it, cedar and iron, and something she did not have a precise word for, the way certain stones smelled when they had been holding heat for a long time, and you pressed your hand against them. She kept her attention on the pups. She noted, with a careful and private portion of her awareness, that the neck of her collar felt very warm. She ignored this. "You are the one who reorganized the medicinal inventory," he said. She looked at him. Yes. The physician mentioned it. He was specific about who had done it. He had been looking for silverweed for 4 days before I reorganized the records. I imagine the specificity is not surprising. His mouth did something. It was brief and controlled, but it was there. He was not unkind about it. I didn't think he was. She looked back at the pups. He is a reasonable man. He is. A pause. What else do you maintain? She listed it plainly. The medicinal inventory, the linen records for the East Wing, the secondary mending log, the nursery night attendance. She kept her voice even and informational, the way she would have spoken to the steward if the steward had asked, though the steward had not asked in 4 years, and she suspected the steward could not have listed the things she maintained if pressed. Caius Dren listened in the way he seemed to do everything, completely, with no visible impatience, with the settled quality of a man who had long ago decided that half a thing was not worth doing. "You have no formal title," he said. "No. You were brought in through Steward Alba's arrangement 4 years ago." She considered this. He had looked into her. Not deeply. The information was not difficult to find if you asked the right person. But he had asked. "Yes. You came through a family connection. An acquaintance of my mother's who knew Alba. It was not a family alliance. It was a word spoken in the right direction. And you've been here 4 years, doing work that belongs to 4 different people." She looked at him again. "It belongs to no one in particular," she said, which was accurate. "So it falls to whoever is present." He regarded her for a long moment. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall, not heavily, just the first quiet suggestion of it, the kind of snow that was less weather and more punctuation. The fire had recovered from its earlier low and threw amber light across the pups and across Sarah's hands and caught, peripherally, on the angle of his jaw. "How old are you?" he said. 23. A pause. He said nothing else on the subject, but she had the sense that the number had landed somewhere in him and been held there. He stood, eventually, with the unhurried economy of someone whose body had learned that no action needed to be rushed. "I'll have someone tend the fire earlier in the evening," he said. "You shouldn't have to maintain it." "It isn't difficult," she said. "No," he said. "I don't imagine it is, for you." He moved toward the door. He stopped. He did not turn around entirely, but he stopped. "What do you call them?" "The pups." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, aware that she had given them names only in the privacy of her own thoughts, which was different from giving them to their father. "I think of the larger one as the noisy one," she said, "and the smaller one as the small one. Those are not names." "No, I don't know their names." She said it plainly, without apology. It was simply true. He was quiet. "Emmerich," he said. "The large one. Soren, the small one." "Emmerich and Soren," she repeated. Not to commit them to memory. She had them already. But because the words wanted to be said in the room where the pups were, in the presence of their father. It seemed right. He left without saying anything else, and the snow outside the window continued its quiet business, and the fire held, and Emmerich made a small, authoritative sound in his sleep that meant he was satisfied, and Soren pressed his nose to Sarah's throat and inhaled. Part 5. The visits became regular, not every evening, but most of them, and with a consistency that felt less like coincidence and more like decision. The kind of choice a very deliberate person makes when they have decided something and are not yet ready to name what they have decided. Sarah told herself this was her own projection. She was not the kind of person who assumed she was the reason for things. She was, more often, the reason for things that went unacknowledged, which was different. He began to ask her questions. Not the administrative kind, or not only those, though there were administrative questions, about the nursery's stores of supplies, and about whether the physician's recommendations had been followed, and about the small one's feeding, in a way that told her he had absorbed what she had said about the positioning, and had been thinking about it at intervals in the days between. He asked those. He also asked other things. "What did you study before you came here?" "Herbcraft. Enough to be competent with the medicinal records, some general knowledge of pack medicine from a woman in my village who kept records for the local healer. Did you want to be a healer? The question surprised her, though she kept that surprise interior. I wanted to be useful, she said. I was practical about what form that could take. He sat with this. That is not the same as wanting, he said finally. No, she agreed. It isn't. She looked at him. I wanted other things. But I was also 19, and I needed to be somewhere that would keep me, and so I was practical. His eyes moved to her face. She had grown, over the visits, accustomed to the weight of his attention, not comfortable with it, precisely, but no longer unsettled by it, in the way the first evening had unsettled her. She had learned to hold her ground inside it, the way you learn to hold your ground in a wind that was not trying to push you over, but was simply moving, and did not stop to consider whether you were in its path. You keep yourself very contained, he said. I keep myself useful, she said, which was not quite a deflection, and not quite an agreement, but occupied the space between them fairly. He leaned back slightly in the chair. The fire threw its amber light, and the pups, who had both been fed, and were both drowsing in the crib now, made small sounds at intervals. The nursery had warmed since he had spoken to someone about the fire. It was tended now by the younger attendant, Bellin, who came in the late afternoon without being reminded, and who had taken to leaving a cup of tea near the chair Sarah occupied, still hot when she arrived, which was a kindness of the small and unasked kind that Sarah had never known what to do with except feel it. You have not asked me anything, he said, in all of this. She considered this. You haven't invited it. I am inviting it now. She looked at him carefully. She thought about what she actually wanted to know, which was a slightly different question than what it would be appropriate to ask, and she navigated the gap. Their mother, she said, you don't have to tell me, but if there is something I should know in order to care for them properly, medically, or in terms of what they might need, that I am not providing, I would want to know it. His face did not close. She had expected it to, and it did not. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, She died at the birth. The bond had been fragile, the kind of circumstance where the body does not recover from the severing. I'm sorry, Sarah said. It was not your loss to carry. No, but it was a loss, and you named it in this room, and I am saying I'm sorry. She said it simply, not with performance. She meant it. He looked at her for a long time after that. She did not look away. She held his gaze the way she held everything, steadily, without strain, without trying to make it mean more than it was, or less. They like you, he said, eventually. He meant the pups. Emmerich likes everyone, she said. He has no taste at all. Soren is more selective. She glanced at the crib, where Soren was half awake, blinking his pale eyes at the ceiling. I think Soren approves of me. Soren has very good taste, he said, and it was the plainest sentence, and it landed with a weight she pretended not to feel in the side of her ribs. She thought about the inventory. She thought about the silver weed, the boot heel, the strip of cloth that had once been a sash. She thought, do not mistake warmth for something it is not. Do not build on the wrong ground. She had been practical at 19, and she would be practical now. It was the thing that had kept her. But she sat with the warmth of the fire, and the pups half sleeping, and Kajastren quiet in the chair 3 feet from her, and the warmth at the side of her neck that she kept refusing to name, and she allowed herself, for exactly as long as the fire held its amber peak, to simply be there, not invisible, not managing herself into acceptable edges. Simply there. Soren climbed over the edge of the crib rail with catastrophic ambition and immediately fell back in. Emmerich made a deeply offended sound. Caius turned his face away, and the remote cousin of a smile appeared for a full second and vanished. Sarah looked back at the pups and did not permit herself to smile, but it was a near thing. Part 6. The letter from the disciplinary office of court attendants arrived on a morning in late winter when the cold had stiffened everything, the air, the ground, the latches on the east wing doors, and Sarah found it waiting on top of her ledger when she came into the medicinal stores at her usual early hour. It was not a long letter. It did not need to be. The disciplinary office of court attendants, which was administered by a woman named Hadra Voss, who had held that administration for 11 years with the focused competence of someone who understood that institutional procedure was its own form of power, did not traffic in lengthy communication. It trafficked in the precise. The letter stated that an investigation had been opened into Sarah's presence in the Alpha King's nursery on the grounds of unsanctioned access to restricted court space. It stated that her attendance in the nursery had not been formally authorized through proper channels, which was accurate. Mira had arranged it verbally, with no written record and no approval from Voss's office. It stated that pending investigation, Sarah was to cease attendance in the nursery immediately and make herself available for a formal review within 7 days. It stated all of this in language that was careful and correct and entirely indifferent to her. She read it twice. She placed it back on the ledger. She knew Hadra Voss by reputation, which was sufficient. Voss was not cruel. Sarah had trained herself away from assigning cruelty where it was not present, because accuracy was more useful than emotion. Voss was an institutionalist. She operated through the logic of procedure, and the logic of procedure in this case was clear. An Omega, with no formal title and no formal authorization, had been found in close proximity to the Alpha King's children, and whatever the explanation had not gone through the proper channels, and the proper channels existed for reasons that were not entirely unreasonable, and the investigation was therefore not malicious. It was mechanical. It would grind through its own logic and arrive at an outcome, regardless of whether that outcome was just, because outcomes and justice were not the same concern, and Voss did not appear to lose sleep over the distinction. The mechanical part would be manageable if Sarah worked quickly. She opened a new page in the ledger and began writing. The first thing she wrote was a list of every date she had attended the nursery. She had kept no formal record of this, but she kept records in her head with the same precision she kept them on paper. She could list the dates because she had been there for all of them, and her memory for such things was exact. She wrote them in order, with the hours, and at each date she noted who else had been present, whether Mira had been in the room when she arrived, and whether the fire had been adequate. Then she wrote a second list, a record of the inventory work, the linen records, the mending log, every formal outcome of her attendance in this court over 4 years, dated, complete. She was still writing when Belan appeared in the doorway of the medicinal stores, which was unusual because Belan's morning routine did not include this room. The young attendant held a cup of tea and looked at Sarah with the expression of someone who has learned something and is not entirely sure how to present it. "You've heard," Sarah said. "Voss posted the investigation on the internal board," Belan said. "This morning, before the first hour." She held out the tea. Sarah took it. "Thank you." "It's not right," Belan said, "what she's doing." "It may not be right, but it is her prerogative," Sarah said. Mira's arrangement was verbal and undocumented. Voss's office has standing to question undocumented arrangements in restricted spaces. You weren't doing anything wrong." "I know that," Sarah said. "The question is whether I can demonstrate it in terms that her process accepts." She turned back to the ledger. "Please don't say anything to anyone about this, including Upward." Belan hesitated. "He will hear about it," she said carefully. "The board is not private." "I know," Sarah said. "That is not the same as asking someone to tell him." She looked at the page in front of her. "I would like to resolve this in the appropriate channels. Whatever happens after that is what happens." Belan left. Sarah drank the tea and went back to the list, and wrote until the early morning cold had thinned into the ordinary pale cold of a winter day, and the medicinal stores smelled of camphor and dried herbs, and the familiar particular dusty sweetness that had become, without her choosing it, the scent of her own competence. She was not afraid. She was something closer to very, very focused. Part 7. The formal review was held on the 6th day, in a room on the administrative floor that Sarah had never entered before, and that had the feel of a room designed to remind you of the distance between yourself and the institution you stood inside. The table was long. Hadra Voss sat at its far end with 2 advisors flanking her, both of whom had the look of people who had made a preliminary determination and were present as a courtesy. Sarah sat at the opposite end of the table with her ledger and a separate folio she had spent 5 days assembling. "You are aware of the nature of the investigation," Voss said. She was perhaps 50, with the upright posture of someone who had held their discipline for so long it had become structural. Her eyes were grey and precise, and not unkind, which was different from being kind. "I am," Sarah said. "The nursery in which you have been attending the Alpha King's children is a restricted space under Court Protection Charter, Article 11. Access requires formal authorization from this office or direct written sanction from the Alpha King himself." "I understand. You have no such authorization on record." "That is correct." She placed the folio on the table and slid it toward the center, equidistant, which was not offering it and not withholding it. "I have a different document, if you are willing to look at it." Voss looked at it. She did not open it immediately. "What is the document?" "A copy of Article 11, in full, with the relevant subsections marked, specifically subsection 4, which creates a provision for emergency access in circumstances where the primary authorized attendant is absent and an unattended minor or infant is in immediate need of care." Voss was quiet. "I have also included the dates and times of each evening on which I entered the nursery. On each of those evenings, Mira, the primary authorized attendant, was not present in the nursery at the time I entered. I arrived to find the pups either crying without response or inadequately attended." She kept her voice even. "On each of those evenings, I entered the nursery under the subsection 4 provision. I then remained for the duration of the night, which falls under continuous care, exception clause 4A. One of the advisors had opened the folio. "This is documented," the advisor said. "I can only document what I can document," Sarah said. "The dates are from my own records, which I acknowledge are not official court records. However, the court physician was present on 2 of the early evenings and can confirm the status of the nursery at those times. I have included his contact information." Hadra Voss had opened the folio now and was reading with the attention of someone who was encountering a document that was organized better than she had expected. Sarah watched her read. She did not fill the silence. She had learned that filling silence was almost always the wrong choice. "You researched the charter," Voss said, finally. "I keep records," Sarah said. "When I keep records, I like to understand the structure I'm working inside." "You prepared this in 5 days." 6, Sarah said. "The review was on the 7th day. I had 6. A pause. One of the advisors looked at the other. Voss closed the folio. "The subsection 4 provision," Voss said, "was intended for circumstances where no authorized personnel were available in the court at all, not for circumstances where the authorized attendant was in her quarters." "I understand the intended scope," Sarah said. "I also know that a 3-week-old wolf pup does not understand the difference between an attendant in her quarters and an attendant who is absent, and that in the 8 seconds between the moment I arrived and the moment I could have returned to my room to send a formal notification to your office, the pup would have been alone in a cold room." She said it without heat. "I am not arguing that my interpretation is the only possible reading of the subsection. I am saying that it is a defensible reading and that I acted in good faith under it, and that the outcome was that 2 infant wolves were kept safe and warm through winter nights when their primary attendant was repeatedly unavailable. The room was quiet. Outside the window, which faced east, the winter light was thin and white and very still. Voss looked at her for a long time with those grey, precise eyes. "You are not what I expected," she said, finally. "I rarely am," Sarah said. Voss set the folio aside. She picked up a pen. "I will note the investigation as reviewed and filed without determination of misconduct," she said. "The subsection 4 question is not a finding I am prepared to make in either direction. The provision is ambiguous." "It is," Sarah agreed. "You may continue in your current arrangement until such time as a formal authorization is issued or withdrawn." Voss looked at the paper in front of her. "I would recommend formalizing the arrangement through this office." "I would welcome that," Sarah said. She walked out of the room with her ledger under her arm and her folio in hand, and the left heel of her boot sounding quietly against the stone floor of the administrative corridor, and she did not feel triumphant, because triumph was not a productive state, and also it was cold in the corridor, and she had several hours of inventory work ahead of her. She felt something quieter than triumph, something like, I handled it, and it is handled, and I did not need anyone to do it for me. That was enough. Part 8. He came to her that evening, not to the nursery. She was in the medicinal stores, updating the inventory by the light of a lamp she had set on the shelf above the ledger, when she heard the footstep in the doorway. She knew it was him before she turned around, not from any mystical recognition, but from the simple logic of his gait, which she had heard enough times in the nursery hallway to know its rhythm. She turned. He was not in the doorway of the nursery now. He was in a different doorway, the one that led to her room, to her space, to the ordinary unglamorous work of her daily existence. He was framed there with the low lamp behind her and the cold air from the corridor beyond him, and he was looking at her with an expression she had grown better at reading over the past weeks, which was not the same as fully understanding it. "You didn't tell me," he said. "There was nothing to tell you. It was mine to manage." Hudra Voss posted the investigation on the institutional board. "I saw that it had been posted. And you did not think that might warrant—" He stopped. She watched him do the thing she had seen him do in the nursery sometimes, when the wolf and the man disagreed about something. He went very still, and then he continued, and the next thing he said was the considered version, not the first one. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want it resolved by your interference," she said. "I wanted it resolved by the evidence." She held his gaze. "I wanted Voss to look at what I had and make her decision on the merit of what was there. If you had intervened, that becomes impossible. It becomes an alpha's preference rather than a documented fact." He was quiet. "I know how this court works," she said. "I know what would have been said about why the investigation was dropped. If you had spoken first. I would rather have a record that says the investigation was reviewed and found without merit than a record that says it disappeared because someone powerful disliked the inconvenience of it." He crossed the room, not quickly, but steadily, the way he moved everywhere, with the unhurried deliberateness that was his particular signature. He stopped close to her, not crowding, but near, the nearest he had been to her, in all the evenings of the nursery and all the conversations in the firelit room. She was very aware of the warmth at the side of her neck. She did not reach for it. "She would have removed you," he said, "if the documentation had been insufficient. I know. You were not certain it was sufficient." "I was not entirely certain, no." He looked at her, really looked at her, in the way that had been building across all the weeks of the nursery. That was not quite the look of someone seeing a person for the first time, and was also not quite like anything else she had a word for. "I was going to attend the review," he said. "I chose not to, because you had asked Belan not to involve anyone. She was still. You were watching. I was watching, he said, which was plain admission, and it was not an apology, and she did not think he meant it as one. She thought about what to do with that. She thought about it carefully, in the way she thought about most things. Why? She said. Not accusation, genuine inquiry. He was quiet for a moment. Because I needed to know if you could. She held that sentence. And now you know. And now I know. He reached out and very carefully, with no excess of gesture, set his hand against the edge of her jaw, and the warmth at the side of her neck did not merely warm. It became something she could not pretend was ambient temperature or proximity to the fire. It became unmistakable. What I know, he said, is that you are the most capable person in this court who does not have a single formal recognition to show for it. She did not move away from his hand. I have the inventory. Sarah. I know, she said, which was not the same as agreeing to whatever was happening, but was also not a denial of it. I am not asking because the pups need you, he said, though they do. I am not asking because you resolved Voss's review, though you resolved it better than I would have. His thumb rested at the angle of her jaw. I am asking because I have been sitting in that nursery every evening for a month and a half, and the only place in this court where I do not feel like the weight of it is past carrying is in that room, with you. She was very still. Stay, he said. Not in the nursery, not as the attendant. Stay as... He paused, and in that pause, she heard the century-weighted deliberateness of it, a man measuring a word before he put it somewhere permanent. Stay as someone I have chosen, not because you are placed here, because I am choosing you. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the north-facing room, the grey shift and the cast-off overdress, and the boot with the split heel. The inventory no one had thanked her for. The 14 passes around the nursery in the dark. Yes, she said. He exhaled. It was the smallest sound, barely a sound at all, but she heard in it the thing that had been held for a very long time, finally, quietly, allowed to put itself down. Part 9. The court took some time to understand what had changed. It understood it first through the biological logic that courts run on, through the slight and unmistakable shift in how the air moved when Sarah entered a room with Caius present, through the way wolves, who had never looked at her directly, began, at some unconscious level below the reach of their own reasoning, to look, through the way a path cleared for her that had not cleared before, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but as a ripple of adjustment that moved through a group of wolves the way current moves through still water, subtle and undeniable, and carrying a meaning that no one needed to announce because their bodies had already announced it. She watched this happen with the same careful attention she applied to everything. She did not perform in response to it. She did not smooth herself into a new shape to match the room's revised understanding of her. She kept the inventory. She kept the ledger precise. She continued to rise early and work the hours that needed working, and sit with Emmerich and Soren in the evenings, though the chair was different now, and better placed, and the fire was always high when she arrived, tended without being asked. Soren, who had very good taste, noticed no difference in her. Emmerich noticed that there was now sometimes a second pair of hands available to hold him when he wanted to be held rather than put down, which was often, and was satisfied. The early spring arrived slowly, the way it always did in Ashvale, not with declaration, but with increments, a degree of warmth gained and held for a day, then another day, the grey sky brightening in careful stages, until one morning there was actual light coming through the nursery window, amber and direct, and it fell across the floor and across the pups where they were crawling, in the increasingly determined way of infant wolves discovering that their legs could do things, and across Sarah's hands where she sat with the ledger she had brought with her, because there was no reason to be idle. Caius sat in the chair beside hers. He had taken to being present in the mornings as well as the evenings, when court duty permitted. He was reading a document, or had been, but the document was resting on his knee with his attention elsewhere, on the pups, and on her hands moving across the page, and on the room in general, in the settled way of a person who has found a place to put weight he has been carrying alone for a very long time. She did not remark on this, she let it be. Between them, neither performing nor denying, the bond settled into its proper shape, not the wild and urgent claiming of a new thing, but the quiet, inhabitable warmth of a thing that had been true for some time, and had finally stopped being resisted. The warmth at the side of her neck had become something she had stopped refusing to name. He had not claimed her in the formal sense, not yet, and she understood the weight of what that step meant for both of them, the permanence of it, the irrevocability, and she was not in a hurry. She had been patient for a long time, and had found that patience, applied to the right things, was not the same as passivity. She was not passive. She was simply waiting for the morning that arrived, having earned itself. He had given her a room that faced east. She had looked at it for a long time before she had agreed to move her things, which were not many: the ledger, the folio, the mending kit, the extra layer, and the boots with the split left heel, which she had still not resold because they were still doing their job, and there was no reason to replace something that was still doing its job. He had noticed the boots. He had not commented on them. He was, she had come to understand, a man who noticed most things and had learned to choose with great care which ones to speak. "Emmerich," she said, without looking up from the ledger, because Emmerich had been inching toward the open door for the past several minutes with the focused, unconvincing casualness of someone who believed they were being subtle. Emmerich sat down and looked at the ceiling. Lias glanced at her with the remote cousin of a smile and returned to his document. The morning light held. The spring held its increment of warmth. Outside the window, the Ashvale grounds were beginning the slow business of becoming green again. Sarah finished the line she was writing and looked at the page and found it was good. Part 10. By early summer, the pups had discovered their legs in earnest, and the nursery was no longer a room that could be considered static, which meant the mornings had a different quality than the winter mornings, more mobile, louder, requiring more active tracking of two small wolves who had separate and frequently incompatible plans for what the space should be used for. Sarah had adapted. She was good at adapting. Caius joined her most mornings. He sat in his chair, or he knelt on the floor with the pups, or he stood in the doorway of the nursery watching the room, with the quality of attention she had come to recognize as his form of happiness, quiet and present, and wholly contained, not because it was small, but because he had spent so long keeping everything in, that the muscle for it was still engaged, even when there was no longer a reason for it. She thought he was learning to unclench it. She was not going to rush him. The inventory was current. The ledger was precise. The medicinal stores had been reorganized twice more since the first time, and a younger court member had asked, formally and in writing, to apprentice with her in the record-keeping, which was the first time the work had generated a request of that kind, and she had said yes. Belan still left tea by her chair. This had not changed, and she did not expect it would. The morning she remembered best from that summer was not remarkable. It was a morning like others had been, early light through the east window, Emmerich already moving with his perpetual confident energy, Soren sitting with the careful observation of a wolf who had decided that understanding what was happening was more interesting than participating in it. Caius beside her, reading. The sound of the court beyond the nursery walls, beginning its day. She was doing the inventory. He looked over and said, without ceremony, "You are doing the inventory in the nursery again." "It goes with me," she said. "Does it need to be done right now?" She looked at Soren, who was looking at her with his pale and assessing eyes. "Soren thinks so," she said. "Soren thinks what you think," Caius said. "He always has." She looked at Soren. Soren looked at her with the expression of a wolf who had made his affiliation known some time ago and found it requiring no further comment. She closed the ledger. The morning light came through the east-facing window and lay across the room in the way of light that had decided to stay. She sat in it with the pups, and with Caius, and with the ledger closed on her knee, and she thought nothing in particular, not about the inventory, not about the boot heel, not about the north-facing room and the 4 years and the strip of cloth that had once been a sash. She thought, "This is morning. It is simply morning." It was not remarkable. It was the nursery, and the light, and the pups, and the sound of Emmerich falling into something, with his characteristic combination of ambition and poor planning, and Caius exhaling through his nose in the way that was the full version of a smile. It was simply the morning, and the morning was hers, and it was everything. Would you have stayed in that chair, patient, invisible, doing the work, long enough to be found? Let me know in the comments below.